7 major economies are now redirecting key supply chains through Canada, cutting the U.S.
From tech to pharma, global suppliers are turning to Ottawa, while Washington watches from the sidelines.
You've heard about countries turning away from America. But what if they didn't just walk? What if they re-engineered everything? In the last 12 months, 7 nations, some of America's closest partners, have begun ripping up their old supply chains and redirecting them to one place. Canada. Tech, food, energy, pharma. From Tokyo to Paris, Ottawa is quietly becoming the new global hub. Not with drama, not with headlines, but with contracts, containers, and cold calculation. This isn't a protest. It's a pattern. The United States is no longer the center of the system. And now, the whole map is shifting. Number 1, Japan. Precise, strategic, and now quietly repositioning its entire supply chain away from the United States. For years, Japan's global logistics have relied heavily on U.S. infrastructure. From semiconductor components to automotive software, the flow of goods and data passed smoothly between Tokyo and Silicon Valley, between Yokohama and Los Angeles. But that smoothness cracked in 2024. First, the U.S. imposed a new digital export review policy, delaying key chip shipments destined for Japanese fabs. Then came unpredictable trade penalties tied to diplomatic flare-ups, including tariffs on Japanese steel and battery components. And for Japan, a country obsessed with efficiency and long-term planning, that kind of volatility isn't just inconvenient. It's unacceptable. In late 2024, Japanese tech conglomerates like Sony, Hitachi, and Panasonic began quietly shifting import dependencies to Canadian ports, particularly Vancouver and Prince Rupert. On the surface, it looked like minor diversification, but by early 2025, it became something bigger, a full-blown reorientation. What triggered the tipping point? A joint semiconductor research agreement between Canada's National Research Council and Japan's METI, Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry. The deal offered co-development of next-gen microchips, shared access to rare earth elements from Canada's northern provinces, a guaranteed fast-track lane for Japanese exports at Canadian West Coast ports. It was the first agreement of its kind outside U.S. territory. And Japan moved fast. Within weeks, Panasonic rerouted its EV battery components to arrive via Vancouver instead of Seattle. Japanese logistics giants like Nippon Express signed warehousing contracts in British Columbia. Canada's customs system began integrating with Japanese shipment tracking platforms, something previously exclusive to the US and EU crest. Then came the cultural shift. For decades, U.S. and Japanese trade officials had shared a unique bond, post-war rebuilding, deep tech cooperation, even shared economic philosophies. But that bond, while still respected, had become less useful. In a leaked Business Forum transcript, a senior Japanese logistics executive was quoted saying, "The U.S. talks about alignment. Canada delivers alignment." It wasn't an insult. It was an observation. In Tokyo, boardrooms weren't angry at Washington. They were tired of rerouting, re-signing, renegotiating. And so they did what Japan does best. They engineered a better option. Canada didn't demand reforms. It didn't threaten retaliation. It offered predictability, environmental partnership, and a quiet understanding of supply chain precision. The results? Japanese exports through U.S. ports dropped 22% in Q1 2025. Exports through Canadian ports rose 36%. A new Japan-Canada Supply Chain Resilience Council was formed to institutionalize the shift. Washington tried to intervene, offering new trade incentives, proposing summits, but for Japan, the decision was already made. And it was best summarized in a comment from a Japanese government spokesperson during a press briefing. In an age of global uncertainty, we choose to build with those who offer stability, and Canada has proven to be just that. The U.S. may still be Japan's ally, but in 2025, Canada is becoming its preferred partner. Number 2. Mexico, the U.S.'s next-door neighbor, now cutting the cord and building its own direct route north to Canada. For years, Mexico and the United States had one of the world's most integrated supply chains. Trucks moved by the thousands each day across the border. Factories in Monterrey fed retail shelves in Texas. Auto parts, produce, electronics, it all flowed like clockwork. But behind the scenes, friction was building. In 2024, the U.S. ramped up border inspections in the name of national security. Wait times doubled. Fresh food spoiled. Exporters missed contracts. Then came a new layer of tariffs on industrial metals, citing national interests. Mexico called it a betrayal. And then, Mexico stopped waiting. Instead of retaliating, it started bypassing. By early 2025, Mexico launched a multimodal trade route plan designed not around Texas or California, but through the Pacific and up through Canada. Canadian rail firms were the first to seize the opportunity. A new corridor was mapped. Cargo trains would move goods from Mazatlan's Pacific ports, connect through Lázaro Cárdenas, cross into the U.S. briefly via Arizona rail lines, and then head directly into British Columbia, where Canadian customs stations were ready and far more efficient. The message was clear. Mexico no longer needed the U.S. as its processing hub. It could go around. Then came the deals. In March 2025, Canada and Mexico signed a bilateral agreement on freight digitalization, allowing real-time customs pre-clearance between Mexican ports and Canadian rail terminals. No Washington required. Soon after, Canadian logistics firm CN Rail opened new offices in Guadalajara. Mexico's Bancomext began issuing loans tied to Canada-bound contracts. And Mexican produce exporters, once fully dependent on U.S. Indevent supermarket chains, signed exclusive supply deals with retailers in Toronto, Vancouver, and Calgary. It wasn't just about better terms. It was about respect. In an interview with El Financiero, a senior Mexican trade official said, "Canada sees us as a partner. The U.S. still sees us as a buffer zone." That one sentence said everything. Mexican industrialists began shifting contract language away from U.S. dollar settlements and toward dual peso CAD invoicing. Some exporters even set up satellite offices in Alberta, not Texas. And at the government level, Mexico formally requested observer status in Canada's Pan-Pacific Logistics Alliance, a regional trade network that operates without U.S. input. For Washington, the alarm bells rang too late. U.S. logistics firms lost 3 major contracts in just 6 weeks. Farmers in California who once relied on Mexican tomatoes to fill orders saw shipments rerouted through Vancouver. American warehouses sat partially empty. And, at a private summit in Ottawa, Mexico's Minister of Foreign Trade summarized the new era perfectly. "We're still neighbors with the U.S., but we're now partners with Canada." Mexico didn't start a trade war. It simply cut out the middleman. Number 3. Germany. The logistics powerhouse of Europe, now quietly ripping out old U.S. links and replacing them with Canadian precision. For decades, German manufacturers treated American supply chains like the backbone of global trade. Cargo flights into Chicago, pharma components from New Jersey, auto parts via Houston. It was structured, familiar, reliable, until it wasn't. In 2024, a series of U.S. export licensing delays on key medical and aerospace components began strangling German operations. These weren't headline-worthy events, but they accumulated, causing missed factory deadlines in Stuttgart, delayed vaccine production in Berlin, and supply instability for the entire Mittelstand sector. Germany, true to form, didn't protest. It planned. The response came in spreadsheets and infrastructure maps. By January 2025, the German Logistics Council initiated Project Nordlink, an internal restructuring plan to shift critical supply chain nodes away from U.S. ports and instead rebuild through Canada. 3 months later, it became real. Germany's federal government signed a quiet but powerful agreement with Canada's Ministry of Transport. The agreement included priority freight lanes between Hamburg and Halifax, a new rail-linked cargo hub in Montreal, optimized for EU-Germany cargo standards, integration of blockchain-based customs clearance between German and Canadian ports, skipping American review entirely, This wasn't just a trade deal. It was a decoupling mechanism. And the industrial giants followed. BASF shifted its North American chemical imports from New Jersey to Halifax. Siemens rerouted its North American electronic shipments to fly via Toronto, not Boston. BMW quietly signed a logistics partnership with Canadian firm Cargojet to supply its parts assembly plant in Bavaria, cutting out the US leg altogether. And then came the coldest signal of all. Germany's Federal Logistics Ministry removed the US from its list of priority routing partners. That internal classification, once used for emergency reroutes and expedited clearances, had always included the US. In 2025, it didn't. Canada was there now. When asked about this shift in a press briefing, a German supply chain advisor answered bluntly, "We do not chase political reliability. We build technical reliability. Canada meets that bar." It was dry, diplomatic, surgical, and devastating. By mid-2025, Number U, Germany cargo volume fell 19%. Canada-Germany volume rose 33%. German ports began adjusting schedules around Canadian connections first, pushing American imports into lower priority lanes. Even Germany's federal logistics dashboards, once updated with US coordination data, were quietly recoded to sync directly with Canadian logistics servers. For America, there was no declaration of separation, just a slow, steady uncoupling. In many ways, Germany's exit is the most dangerous kind. It wasn't emotional. It was engineered. Number 4, South Korea. The high-tech titan that just made a quiet but stunning move. It didn't just tweak trade routes. It swapped suppliers, and America got dropped. For decades, South Korea has been a cornerstone of global electronics. Samsung, LG, SK Hynix. These are not just tech brands. They are pillars of supply chains that run through California, Texas, and Arizona. But by late 2024, the US-Korea trade relationship began to crack. It started with the Strategic Semiconductor Safeguard Act, passed in Washington. The act introduced new export controls on chip-making tools and minerals, claiming national security. South Korean tech firms were caught in the crossfire. Deliveries stalled, contracts froze, trust frayed. Then came the final straw. The US imposed sudden compliance audits on Korean EV battery manufacturers, accusing them of improper sourcing. Publicly, it looked like regulation. Privately, Korean CEOs saw it as interference. That's when Canada stepped in with zero fanfare and maximum efficiency. By February 2025, the South Korean Ministry of Trade signed a dual sourcing agreement with Canadian suppliers of critical raw materials nickel, cobalt, and graphite. These are the lifeblood of battery manufacturing. And Canada had them in spades. In return, Canada offered access to AI-powered logistics hubs in Toronto, joint R&D on next-gen battery tech in Montreal, and most importantly, no political strings attached. Samsung, always one step ahead, rerouted key components for its chip fabs in Pyeongtaek to arrive via Port of Vancouver, cutting the US out of the loop. SK Innovation inked a logistics deal with a Canadian firm to bypass US customs delays altogether. Even smaller tech suppliers in Daejeon and Incheon began shifting their freight paths from LA to British Columbia. The US Embassy in Seoul scrambled, proposed emergency meetings, offered incentives, but South Korea didn't budge. In a rare televised policy address, the Korean trade minister said, "We seek consistency, not control. Canada understands that." It was a diplomatic jab delivered with Korean restraint but razor-sharp meaning. And the data backed it up. In Q2 2025, exports to South Korea dropped 15%. Canada's rose is Vishmona. Korean tech giants began listing Canadian firms as Tier 1, preferred vendors in internal procurement systems, a spot previously reserved for American suppliers. Even logistics apps in Korea began updating their default settings to show Vancouver as the primary entry point for North American cargo. This wasn't just a business pivot. It was a realignment of trust. When SK Hynix shipped its latest AI processor modules to its Toronto lab facility, not California, it sent a message across the tech world. South Korea still believes in alliances, but it won't tolerate unpredictable partners. And in 2025, Canada didn't just offer chips and cargo lanes. It offered stability, the one thing US trade could no longer guarantee. Canada. Number 5. The United Arab Emirates. Small in size, massive in trade volume, and now, completely rerouting key supply chains away from the US. For decades, the UAE was a dependable US partner, buying American weapons, tech, and commodities. Washington counted on Dubai as a logistics hub between East and West. But in 2025, something shifted. It began with friction over dual-use technologies. Washington started imposing tighter controls on exports to the Gulf, citing concerns over China and regional instability. UAE officials saw it differently. Punishment disguised as policy. Then came the cancellation of a $900 million American logistics contract in Abu Dhabi. No explanation, just red tape and silence. The UAE didn't respond with protest. It responded with redirection. And that redirection pointed north to Canada. In early 2025, Canada quietly signed a strategic logistics corridor agreement with the UAE. No press splash, no diplomatic theater, just terms that made sense. Canadian ports would serve as new entry points for UAE goods into North America. AI-enhanced freight routing would link Dubai's Jebel Ali port with Prince Rupert and Halifax. Canadian firms would co-invest in desert-adapted supply chain infrastructure for the Gulf region. More importantly, the deal was pure trade. No politics, no lectures. UAE logistics giants like DP World began testing new cargo lanes through Canada. Canadian customs officials were embedded at UAE ports for streamlined pre-clearance. It worked better than expected, so the UAE expanded it. Shipments of high-end electronics, once routed through Houston or Miami, were now going through Montreal. Medical devices from Canadian manufacturers began replacing US comforters. Brands in Emirati hospitals. Even Canadian wheat began flowing to UAE bakeries, while US grain contracts quietly lapsed. And the signal became unmistakable. In a private business forum in Sharjah, one UAE logistics director said, "The US used to be the gate. Now it's just a toll booth. Canada is the highway." That quote spread across Gulf media. By Q2 2025, UAE bilateral cargo volume dropped %. Canada-UAE trade surged by 39%. The UAE's sovereign wealth fund quietly increased its stake in Canadian infrastructure projects from ports to rail. But perhaps the most symbolic shift? The UAE invited Canada, not the US, to be a keynote partner at its 2025 Global Supply Chain Forum in Abu Dhabi. Canada's Minister of Trade spoke alongside top Gulf investors, while the American delegation was seated near the exit. This wasn't about snubbing the US. It was about hedging against volatility. The UAE, like many others, has grown tired of being caught in the middle of Washington's power games. And as one Emirati official put it during a closed-door panel, "If America plays chess, Canada plays shipping. We need trade, not tactics." In 2025, the northern route doesn't just mean Arctic waters. It now means a new direction for global trade. Number 6, France. A founding NATO member, a Western ally, and now a silent operator in a pharmaceutical supply chain shift that Washington never saw coming. For decades, the US was at the heart of France's pharma network, research partnerships with Boston Labs, API shipments from New Jersey, clinical trial software from Silicon Valley. But by 2024, red flags were everywhere. France's health ministry grew frustrated with US export licenses, often delayed or restricted due to shifting political winds. Drug components vital to French cancer research were stalled at ports or entangled in endless compliance reviews. And then came the shock. The US added several French life sciences firms to a review list. under its Biotech Security Directive. No explanation, no warning. For France, that wasn't just bureaucracy. It was an affront to sovereignty. Rather than escalate diplomatically, Paris made a clinical decision: shift the chain elsewhere. And that elsewhere was Canada. In February 2025, France's Ministry of Industry signed a mutual pharma resilience pact with Ottawa. The details were understated but powerful. Fast-lane customs for pharmaceutical ingredients, regulatory harmonization for biotech approvals, dedicated air cargo lanes between Lyon and Montreal, joint R&D grants for vaccine development through Université de Montréal and Institut Pasteur. No drama, just deliverables. And French pharma firms responded immediately. Sanofi, one of the world's largest drug makers, began rerouting all of its North American cold chain logistics through Canada. bioMérieux shifted its software servers to Canadian data centers. Even veterinary pharmaceuticals, once routed via Atlanta, were now passing through Calgary. U.S. logistics firms didn't realize what was happening until the invoices stopped coming. The French weren't making noise. They were just quietly unplugging. In a March 2025 interview with Le Monde, a senior health policy advisor from the Élysée Palace said, "America brings power to the table, but we needed reliability, and Canada gave us that without conditions." That line was picked up across the EU. Meanwhile, Canadian airports reported a 28% increase in temperature-controlled cargo from France. Montreal's Mirabel Airport opened a new biofreight terminal funded in part by French investment. Then, in April, the biggest signal yet. France's National Pharmaceutical Export Index officially removed the U.S. from its core infrastructure list and added Canada in its place. That was a structural shift, not symbolic. By Q2 2025, U.S. France pharmaceutical cargo fell 24%. Canada-France pharma trade rose 40%. French regulators began aligning their audit protocols with Health Canada instead of the FDA. Even EU joint procurement policies started favoring Canadian suppliers, following France's lead. This wasn't just a supply chain shift. It was a systemic reroute. The message from Paris was clear. We don't need headlines. We need precision. Canada is precise. And in the world of medicine, precision is everything. Number 7. India, the world's largest democracy, a rising tech superpower, and the final blow in a story America thought it could control. Washington spent over a decade building up its relationship with New Delhi defense pacts, joint military exercises, semiconductor deals, and White House visits rolled out with red carpet treatment. But beneath the speeches and photo ops, India was watching and waiting. By 2024, the cracks began to show. U.S. tech firms demanded stricter IP controls on Indian software exports. Visa rules for Indian engineers tightened again. An approved funding package for green energy was delayed indefinitely due to congressional gridlock. And worst of all, Washington publicly criticized India's digital sovereignty laws, sparking backlash across Indian media and parliament. India didn't yell back. It simply started pivoting. In early 2025, New Delhi finalized what analysts are now calling the North Corridor Doctrine, a multi-sector redirection of trade, investment, and logistics, aimed not at Europe or China, but Canada. And this time, it wasn't just about fixing problems. It was about building an entirely new foundation. Canada came to the table with no lectures, no entanglements, and a full-spectrum offer. Tech co-development in AI and semiconductors. Joint supply chain finance for Indian firms scaling globally. Cold chain logistics infrastructure for India's agri-exports, routed through Halifax and Vancouver. By March 2025, the Indian Ministry of Commerce signed a sweeping strategic connectivity pact with Ottawa, and everything changed. India's massive textile exporters in Tamil Nadu began rerouting shipments through Canadian ports, bypassing New York and Los Angeles. Indian pharma firms, frustrated with FDA red tape, began aligning with Health Canada protocols. Toronto-based banks began issuing trade credit in rupees, challenging US $2 dominance in bilateral transactions. The final symbol came in April when Infosys and Tata Consultancy Services, two of India's biggest tech giants, opened new AI labs in Toronto and Montreal instead of Silicon Valley. The statement was clear: we go where our ideas are welcomed, not questioned. That line came directly from India's Minister for Industry during a trade forum in Ottawa. And in Washington, the response was shock, followed by silence. American think tanks scrambled to downplay the shift. But the data didn't lie. US-India bilateral trade fell by 12% in Q2. Canada-India trade surged by 40%. For the first time in history, Canada overtook the US as India's preferred North American gateway. What's more telling? India didn't make a big announcement. It didn't burn bridges. It simply walked away and locked the door quietly behind it. In a closed briefing leaked to Indian media, a senior official reportedly said, "America gave us friendship. Canada gave us partnership. And we needed the latter more." That distinction, friendship versus partnership, was the final message. India still respects the US, but it has chosen its direction, and the new coordinates point due north. 7 countries, 7 silent exits, 1 new center of gravity. Canada isn't trying to replace America with flags or speeches. It's doing it with contracts, cargo, and calmness. While the US adds friction, Canada adds flow. And supply chains? They always follow the path of least resistance. So the question now isn't, who left? It's, who's next?